In September 1775, when Cambridge's siege of Boston had settled into the routine of blockade, and when the Continental Congress sought ways to expand revolution's scope beyond Massachusetts, when military planners studied maps showing Quebec as British stronghold controlling access to continental interior, and wondered whether audacity might achieve what conventional wisdom said was impossible. An expedition gathered 1,100 souls who would attempt what previous generations had not seriously considered: to march through wilderness that had few European settlements and fewer roads, to emerge at Quebec's stone walls, and to demand that ancient fortress surrender to revolutionaries who carried liberty's conviction, but who lacked the artillery and the siege craft and the resources that taking fortified cities typically required. We begin with the gathering at Cambridge and later at Fort Western in Maine. The volunteers who assembled drawn from New England regiments, soldiers who were farmers and artisans transformed by revolution into military force, men who believed that determination and righteous cause would carry them through challenges that experience might have taught them to fear if they had possessed experience. The confidence born from ignorance being perhaps necessary, because those who truly understood what they were attempting might have refused to attempt it. The expedition's commander was Benedict Arnold Colonel, whose name would later become, in American memory, synonymous with betrayal, but who was in autumn 1775 purely patriot, purely ambitious in ways that revolution rewarded, purely convinced that bold action could achieve what caution would never accomplish. Arnold, whose energy and certainty infected those who followed him with belief that Quebec could be taken despite its walls, and despite its garrison, and despite the distances and the season. Arnold was not creating strategy from nothing. The expedition to Quebec was part of two-pronged offensive, with Richard Montgomery advancing from Fort Ticonderoga toward Montreal, and then toward Quebec from west, while Arnold approached from south through Maine wilderness. The plan being that converging forces would overwhelm defenders who could not adequately respond to simultaneous threats from multiple directions. The strategic logic was sound, even if the practical execution would prove catastrophically difficult in ways that planning had not anticipated, and that maps had not revealed. The preparations took weeks. The accumulation of provisions calculated to sustain 1,100 men for 40 days of marching. The construction of bateaux that would carry soldiers and supplies up rivers, toward the height of land that separated watersheds flowing south toward Atlantic from watersheds flowing north toward St. Lawrence. The organization of companies and the appointment of officers and the creation of supply train and the thousand details that transforming collection of individuals into military expedition required. The soldiers who gathered understood in abstract terms what they were attempting: a march through wilderness, a siege of fortress city, the extension of revolution into Canada, where habitants might welcome liberation from British rule, or might resist American invasion, depending on how they calculated their interests and their loyalties. But abstract understanding was different from experiential knowledge, was knowing route on map rather than knowing what walking that route would require, was anticipating challenges without comprehending what meeting those challenges would demand. The departure from Fort Western on the Kennebec River came in late September, the bateaux loaded with barrels of flour and salted meat and portable soup, and all the provisions that commissary officers believed would sustain march that should take 40 days, but that might take 50 if difficulties arose. The boats riding low in water because supplies for 1,100 men for that duration were heavy. The soldiers boarding or walking alongside river knowing that journey was beginning, but not knowing yet what journey would become. The first steps being easy because they were still in settled territory, because autumn weather was pleasant, because confidence had not yet been tested against reality, because the dying of autumn's breath had not yet given way to winter's arrival, because they were still close enough to Cambridge that retreat remained possible, and close enough to familiar territory that wilderness had not yet closed around them completely. We descend now into what the early days revealed: the bateaux that were heavy when loaded, proving difficult to maneuver in river currents that were stronger than anticipated, the portages around rapids requiring soldiers to unload boats and carry them, and their contents overland distances that were longer and more difficult than maps had suggested. The daily progress being measured in miles that were fewer than planned, because reality of moving 1,100 men and their supplies through wilderness was more complicated than planning had anticipated. The Kennebec River was route chosen because it flowed northward, and because following it would theoretically lead expedition toward the Dead River, and then toward height of land, and then toward rivers that flowed north into St. Lawrence Valley, the water route being preferable to overland march, because boats could carry supplies that soldiers could not carry on their backs. But rivers that appeared on maps as blue lines suggesting smooth passage revealed themselves as obstacles as much as routes rapids that required portaging, shallows where boats grounded, currents that pushed against progress rather than aiding it, water being both path and problem simultaneously. The supplies began diminishing faster than planned. Some bateaux overturned in rapids, and their contents were lost or damaged. Some barrels were discovered to contain provisions that had spoiled before journey began. The calculations that had suggested 40 days of supplies would be adequate proving optimistic, as daily consumption exceeded estimates, and as losses subtracted from total stores more rapidly than distance covered added to progress toward objective. The realization came gradually that 40 days might not be sufficient, that the march was taking longer than anticipated, that supplies were running out faster than planned, that the comfortable margin that planners had assumed was dissolving, and that expedition might arrive at Quebec hungry and weakened rather than strong and ready for siege operations. But turning back was not seriously considered the momentum of having started, the investment of effort already expended, the knowledge that Congress and Washington were counting on expedition success, the pride that prevented admitting that march was more difficult than confidence had suggested. All these factors pushed expedition forward, even as evidence accumulated that forward was becoming increasingly dangerous. We witness the transformation from confidence to concerned soldiers who had departed Fort Western expecting difficult but manageable journey, beginning to understand that difficulty exceeded what they had imagined. Officers who had believed maps and who had trusted calculations beginning to question whether Quebec was actually reachable with force and supplies that were diminishing daily. Arnold himself maintaining optimism publicly, while privately worrying whether expedition would arrive at Quebec in condition to accomplish anything militarily meaningful. The autumn was dying around them, leaves falling from trees until branches were bare, temperatures dropping as September became October, the pleasant weather of journeys beginning giving way to cold rains and to frost at night, nature's calendar moving toward winter whether expedition was ready or not. The seasons' change being reminder that time was enemy as much as distance was enemy. That reaching Quebec mattered only if reaching it happened before winter trapped expedition in circumstances where siege would be impossible, and where retreat would be deadly. We sit with what soldiers carried beyond physical burdens, the letters from families tucked in pockets, the memories of homes they had left, the beliefs about liberty and revolution that had motivated volunteering for expedition that promised hardship, but that had not revealed exactly what that hardship would entail. The identities as farmers or craftsmen that were being temporarily set aside in favor of identities as soldiers serving cause that they believed was just, even if they could not have articulated in sophisticated political terms exactly what that cause meant beyond the visceral sense that British authority was oppressive and that American self-governance was right and worth fighting for. The revolutionary ideology that had sparked Lexington and Bunker Hill was present, but was perhaps less immediate than the practical realities of cold and hunger and exhaustion. The high principles being real, but being abstract compared to the concrete experiences of wading through cold water and portaging heavy boats and sleeping in wet clothes and watching supplies diminish, while distance to Quebec remained discouragingly large. We reflect on beginnings as moments of possibility, the expedition departing with hopes intact, with supplies adequate, with bodies strong, with confidence high. The beginning containing all potential outcomes simultaneously, until experience narrowed possibilities by revealing which outcomes were achievable and which were not. The march through autumn's dying breath being threshold between intention and execution, between plan and reality, between what maps showed and what territory contained, between the confidence that came from not knowing and the harder wisdom that would come from learning through suffering what wilderness demanded from those who attempted to cross it. The army walking through autumn carrying revolution northward, carrying hope that Canada would join rebellion, carrying beliefs about what determination could achieve, walking into forests that closed behind them like water closing over stones, walking toward Quebec that waited beyond their sight, toward winter that waited beyond autumn's death, toward the testing that would reveal whether revolutionary enthusiasm could overcome stone walls and British regulars and smallpox and the cold. We close with expedition disappearing into wilderness, the last settled farms being left behind, the true forest beginning where human habitation ended, the paths becoming fainter until they were only trails known to indigenous peoples who were not guiding this expedition, soldiers walking into spaces that maps showed but could not truly represent, into distances that exceeded what 40 days of supplies could sustain if difficulties accumulated, into the unknown that was also somehow inevitable because they had committed to the march, and because turning back required admitting failure that none were ready to admit. The army that walked through autumn's dying breath, forever departing, forever confident, forever beginning the journey that would test everything they believed about themselves and about what was possible, forever the threshold between the familiar and the strange, between confidence and catastrophe, between the world they knew and the wilderness that would teach them what they did not know, the army walking, the autumn dying, the wilderness waiting, forever the beginning before everything changed, forever. The dead river earned its epithet not through ancient legend or through catastrophe that predated European arrival, but through what it did to Arnold's expedition in October 1775, through the way it consumed time and strength and supplies that were supposed to carry soldiers to Quebec, but that instead were lost to rapids and portages, and the simple grinding difficulty of ascending waterway that fought against passage. River that appeared on maps as route northward, but that revealed itself as obstacle more than as highway. Water that should have eased journey instead making it nearly impossible. The dead river living up to its name by killing hope and strength, and the confident timeline that had suggested 40 days would be sufficient. We begin with expedition reaching the dead river after struggling up the Kennebec, the transition from one waterway to another being marked on maps as simple matter of following rivers northward, but being in reality complicated by the fact that rivers did not always flow in directions that aided progress, that following water sometimes meant fighting against current that was stronger than anticipated, that portaging around obstacles required more time and effort than planning had allocated. The dead river being final major water obstacle before height of land that would mark the divide between southward flowing and northward flowing watersheds. The river that had to be ascended before the descent toward Quebec could begin. The name suggested stillness, dead river, implying water that did not flow, or that flowed so slowly that movement was imperceptible. The naming being perhaps indigenous term translated into English, or being colonial description based on observation during different season, when river's character was different from what October revealed. But the river that expedition encountered was not dead in sense of still, was moving water filled with rapids, and with currents that made ascending it exhausting labor, was river that fought against passage, that required soldiers to wade in water pulling bateaux against flow, the labor being continuous and exhausting and cold because water temperature in October was near freezing, and because staying dry was impossible when work required standing in river pulling boats upstream. Soldiers' clothing becoming soaked and remaining wet because there was no time or fuel for drying garments properly before next day's work began again. The wetness being enemy as insidious as hunger, because it sapped warmth, and because it created conditions where disease could flourish, and where exhaustion accumulated without adequate recovery. It is said that soldiers spent more time in water than in boats. The bateaux were too heavy when loaded to be effectively paddled against current, the only practical method being for men to wade in shallows, pulling boats with ropes, the boats scraping bottom when water was shallow and threatening to overturn when water was deep. The labor being similar to that of canal boat horses, except that horses were stronger and were not simultaneously trying to carry their own equipment and maintain their own nutrition on rations that were inadequate and diminishing daily. The portages around rapids were even more exhausting, required unloading boats completely, carrying cargo overland through forest where no trails existed, then returning for boats themselves which had to be carried or dragged through underbrush and over rocks, and through terrain that seemed designed to make passage as difficult as possible. The portages taking hours or entire days to complete short distances that could have been walked in minutes if soldiers had not been carrying boats and barrels, and all the equipment that expedition required. The accumulation of portages meaning that progress was measured in miles per week rather than miles per day. The timeline that had suggested Quebec by mid-October dissolving as October passed, and expedition was still struggling up the dead river, far short of its objective. We descend into the losses that river inflicted the bateaux that overturned despite soldiers' best efforts, their contents spilling into water and being swept downstream, barrels of flour becoming waterlogged and ruined, the portable soup and salted meat that was supposed to sustain expedition being lost to river that seemed hungry for their supplies, each loss being subtracted from total stores, and being added to the calculation of how many days of provisions remained versus how many days reaching Quebec would require. The mathematics becoming increasingly desperate as numerator decreased faster than denominator, as supplies ran out while distance remaining stayed discouragingly large. Some boats were so damaged by rocks and rapids that they could not be repaired, had to be abandoned, their remaining contents distributed among other boats that became even more heavily loaded and even more difficult to move. the fleet of bateaux that had departed Fort Western being winnowed by attrition, until fewer boats carried more weight and made slower progress. The system that had been designed with redundancy, having that redundancy stripped away by river that consumed boats as readily as it consumed supplies. The soldiers weakened as provisions diminished. The rations that had been sufficient in September were cut in October, as officers calculated that remaining supplies would not last to Quebec at normal consumption rates. The hunger that had been manageable discomfort becoming acute deprivation as cuts were repeated, as daily allotments decreased to levels that could not sustain men doing exhausting physical labor in cold water. The bodies beginning to consume their own muscle and fat to generate warmth and energy that food no longer provided adequately. Soldiers becoming visibly thinner and weaker, the diminishment being gradual enough that those experiencing it did not fully recognize how weakened they had become, until they attempted tasks that had been routine at journey's beginning, and found that they lacked strength to complete those tasks. The realization coming that they were slowly starving, and that reaching Quebec might require endurance that starvation was making impossible. Whispers tell us that some gave up, that soldiers who could not continue, or who concluded that continuing meant dying, chose to turn back, taking their chances with return journey through territory already traversed rather than continuing forward into unknown challenges that they no longer believed they could survive. The departures being sometimes sanctioned by officers who recognized that forcing weakened men to continue was cruelty without purpose, and being sometimes desertions where men simply left during night and were discovered missing at morning muster. Each departure was blow to morale, was visible evidence that some believed expedition was doomed, was subtraction from total force that made Siege of Quebec less feasible, was testimony to the deteriorating situation that officers tried to minimize through speeches about duty, and about being close to destination, and about how turning back was more dangerous than pressing forward. Rhetoric that convinced some, and that failed to convince others, who calculated that their chances of survival were better in retreat than in advance. We witnessed the dead river at evening, soldiers camped along banks after day of exhausting labor, wet clothing steaming around fires that were built despite difficulty of finding dry wood, the smell of smoke and wet wool and unwashed bodies, the sounds of coughing and of conversations kept deliberately cheerful despite circumstances, or kept quietly somber in acknowledgment that situation was worse than anyone wanted to admit openly. the river flowing past with sound that had become familiar, water that they had struggled against all day, continuing its movement southward, while they tried to move northward, the river being permanent and indifferent while they were temporary and desperate, water outlasting their effort and their hope, the dead river earning its name through the slow death it inflicted on expeditions, timeline and strength and supplies, through the way it killed confidence without killing soldiers directly, through the exhaustion and hunger and cold that it created, which would kill some eventually, and which weakened all in ways that would matter later when reaching Quebec, required strength that the dead river had already taken from them. We sit with the question of whether to continue the debate that officers had explicitly and that soldiers had internally, whether pressing forward made sense when conditions were deteriorating, and when Quebec seemed impossibly distant, whether the investment of effort already made required continuing despite mounting evidence that continuing was becoming suicidal, whether retreat was cowardice or prudence, whether the expedition should be abandoned or should be pushed through to conclusion regardless of cost. The questions having no clear answers because future was unknown, and because choosing wrongly meant either dying unnecessarily or failing unnecessarily, neither outcome being acceptable but one having to be chosen. Arnold's determination to continue was not questioned by most. His energy and optimism, and his refusal to acknowledge possibility of failure, were infectious, even when soldiers' own assessments were less optimistic. Leadership being partly ability to convince others to continue when continuation seemed impossible. Authority being exercised not through force, but through example of leader who shared hardships and who maintained confidence when others wavered. We reflect on rivers as barriers, and as paths simultaneously, the dead river serving both functions, being route that expedition followed because alternative of overland march was even more difficult, but being also obstacle that nearly stopped expedition. Water being element that aids and impedes equally depending on circumstances. The same river that could carry boats downstream becoming enemy when ascending against current was necessary. Nature being neither ally nor enemy, but being indifferent force that humans had to adapt to rather than expecting nature to accommodate human purposes. The dead river did not care whether expedition reached Quebec, flowed southward as it always had, eroded banks and moved rocks, and flooded seasonally according to patterns established over centuries. The human struggle happening on its surface being insignificant to river itself. The name, dead, being perhaps more about River's indifference than about its stillness, about the way it consumed expeditions' strength without malice, but also without mercy, being dead to their suffering while being very much alive as River. The paradox of name reflecting paradox of nature that sustained human life through providing water while simultaneously threatening human life through cold and current, and the exhaustion that ascending it required. We close beside the dead river in late October. Expedition still struggling upward, Quebec still distant, supplies nearly exhausted, soldiers weakened and wet and cold, the river flowing past unconcerned with human drama playing out along its banks, the name being earned through every day of struggle, through every portage and every upset boat and every barrel lost to current, through the death of timeline and death of confidence, and the partial death of hope that still survived enough to keep soldiers moving forward, but that was diminished from what it had been when journey began. The river that swallowed its name being also river that nearly swallowed expedition, that consumed supplies and strength and time, that tested everything Arnold's men thought they knew about endurance and about determination, that taught them that nature's obstacles could be as formidable as enemy armies, that revealed limits of what revolutionary enthusiasm could accomplish when confronted with water that flowed against them, and cold that penetrated everything and hunger that weakened with each passing day. The dead river, the struggle, the consumption, the name earned through suffering, forever flowing southward, forever fighting northward progress, forever the river that swallowed its name and nearly swallowed those who attempted to ascend it, forever. Navigation through wilderness that had few landmarks visible from ground level, through forests where canopy obscured sun, and where clouds hid stars, through terrain where rivers twisted in directions that contradicted expectations, and where the distance between maps' representation and territory's reality grew wider with each day's march, required instruments and skill, and also required luck that was not always present, compasses and maps that showed route as comprehensible journey, proving inadequate for preventing disorientation, that transformed expedition from confident march toward objective into wandering through spaces that all looked similar, where progress was uncertain, and where the true direction traveled was not north toward Quebec, but inward toward understanding of how lost humans could become when maps ended and actual territory began. We begin with the maps that Arnold carried, French and British charts showing rivers and approximate topography, cartography based on reports from trappers and from indigenous guides and from earlier military expeditions, the maps being best available information, but being also incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, showing waterways that existed but not showing the rapids and portages that made following those waterways difficult, indicating distances that were approximately correct as measured by latitude and longitude, but that did not account for the actual ground that had to be covered when following winding rivers and when detouring around obstacles, the maps being tools that were necessary but insufficient, representations that simplified reality in ways that made planning possible, but that also made planning unreliable when executed. The compasses that officers carried provided bearing toward north, magnetic needles swinging to point direction that should guide expedition toward Quebec if they could maintain northward progress. The instruments being reliable for indicating direction, but being useless for indicating distance, or for showing what obstacles lay along the bearing they indicated. Compasses pointing north, whether north led through passable terrain or through impassable swamps. Direction being necessary information, but not sufficient information. Knowing which way was north not being same as knowing how to get there. The navigation was art as much as science required judgment about when to follow compass bearing directly, and when to detour around obstacles and hope to regain bearing afterward. Required estimating distances when landmarks were not available for measurement. Required trusting instruments when visual confirmation was impossible, because forest blocked views beyond immediate surroundings. It is said that expedition became disoriented after crossing height of land, the divide between watersheds being reached in early November after desperate struggle up the Dead River, and across swampy terrain that appeared on maps as simply land, without indication of how boggy and difficult passage would be. The crossing of divide being moment when waters should have begun flowing north toward St. Lawrence, and when descent toward Quebec should have begun. But the rivers on northern slope did not flow where maps suggested, or did not exist at all where maps showed them. The expedition finding itself in territory that matched map in general outline, but that differed in crucial details. The disorientation being not total lostness, but being uncertainty about exactly where they were within area where they knew roughly they should be. The difference between knowing they were somewhere in region north of height of land and knowing precisely which drainage they were following being difference between confidence and anxiety, between proceeding according to plan and improvising solutions to unexpected problems. we descend into what disorientation meant, practically the time wasted following waterways that turned wrong directions or that ended in swamps rather than continuing to St. Lawrence. The energy expended on detours and on backtracking when routes proved impassable, the growing gap between where expedition thought they were and where they actually were, the realization that maps could not be fully trusted and that navigation required as much guessing as calculating, the fragile confidence that instruments and charts had provided dissolving as reality contradicted what maps showed, and what compasses implied should be simple matter of following bearing. The hunger that had been growing during struggle up Dead River, intensified after crossing Divide, the supplies that had been depleted by losses, and by time were now nearly exhausted. The daily rations were cut again and again, until soldiers were receiving amounts that barely sustained life, and that certainly did not sustain strength needed for continued marching through difficult terrain. The hunger becoming acute deprivation that dominated consciousness, and that made every decision about route and pace more difficult because exhaustion from starvation reduced capacity for clear thinking. The soldiers began eating anything that might provide calories. The portable soup that was supposed to be emergency reserve was consumed long before Quebec was reached. The salted meat that remained was divided into portions so small that they were barely worth eating. The flour that survived river crossings was made into cakes that were more water than grain, but that at least gave illusion of substance. The desperation progressing from mere hunger to the point where soldiers looked at everything as potential food, regardless of whether it was actually edible. The dogs that had accompanied expedition were killed and eaten animals that had been companions, and that had served purposes like carrying messages or guarding camps becoming food, because starvation overrode sentimentality, the meat being distributed and consumed without ceremony, because hunger did not allow for squeamishness. The leather from shoes and from cartridge boxes was boiled into something that could be swallowed if not digested, the leather providing little nutrition, but providing something for stomachs to process, creating sensation of fullness even if not providing actual sustenance. Soldiers destroying equipment in order to obtain material that might keep them alive few more days. Whispers tell us of divisions emerging between those who had food hidden and those who did not, the officers who kept private supplies, while common soldiers starved, creating resentment that undermined unity and discipline. The discovery that some had been holding back food, while claiming that all shared equally in deprivation, being revelation that damaged morale more than hunger itself, because it demonstrated that solidarity was illusion, that hierarchy persisted even in extremity, that those with authority used that authority to preserve themselves while those without authority suffered more severely. The tensions were expressed carefully because military discipline remained theoretically in force, even when circumstances made enforcement difficult. But the awareness that some were less hungry than others, because some had access to supplies that were supposedly exhausted, created bitterness that would persist even after expedition ended. We witness the moment when first French settlements came into view, the habitants' farms along the Chaudière River representing salvation, because they contained food that could be purchased or requisitioned. The appearance of cultivated fields and wooden houses after weeks in wilderness being almost hallucinogenic in their normalcy. Soldiers who had been stumbling forward in desperate hope, suddenly finding that hope fulfilled at least partially, because they had reached civilization even if they had not yet reached Quebec, the habitants being surprised and perhaps alarmed by appearance of scarecrow soldiers emerging from forests, armed men who looked more like refugees than like military force, whose condition testified to ordeal they had endured, but who still claimed to be army marching to take Quebec. The food that habitants provided, or that Arnold purchased with continental currency that had uncertain value, was consumed with desperation, soldiers eating until they were sick, because stomachs that had been empty for weeks could not handle sudden abundance. The need to continue march toward Quebec conflicting with need to rest and recover from starvation. Arnold pushing expedition forward, because delay meant British would learn of approach and would have time to prepare defenses. We sit with the compass that had pointed north throughout journey, the instrument that had provided bearing, but had not provided food, that had indicated direction, but had not made obstacles disappear, that had been relied upon when maps proved inadequate, but that had also led expedition into territories where hunger waited. The compass pointing toward Quebec, but pointing also toward starvation, because reaching Quebec required endurance that hunger made nearly impossible. The direction and the destination being connected, but being connected through suffering that compass could not measure or show or prevent. The navigation had been successful in sense that expedition reached St. Lawrence Valley and found its way to Quebec's vicinity. But navigation had also been failure in sense that journey took much longer than planned and consumed supplies, much faster than anticipated, and arrived at destination, with force that was weakened and depleted and barely capable of military operations. We reflect on hunger as direction that overrode all other directions, the compass pointing north, but hunger pointing inward, toward the consuming emptiness that demanded attention more insistently than any strategic objective, toward the simple animal need for food that became more important than revolution or liberty or any abstract cause, when starvation threatened immediate survival. The realization that humans are physical beings whose higher purposes depend on having bodies that function, and that bodies cannot function without fuel. The hierarchy of needs asserting itself regardless of ideology. Hunger being direction that could not be ignored, even when other directions were supposedly more important. The compasses had guided expedition north, but hunger had guided them toward desperate measures, and toward the understanding that revolutionary enthusiasm could not overcome starvation, that causes required fed soldiers as well as convinced soldiers, that the struggle for independence required first surviving to continue struggling. We close contemplating navigation through wilderness as metaphor for revolution itself. Both required knowing direction, but both also required endurance through obstacles that appeared without warning. Both required trusting instruments and information that were incomplete. Both required continuing forward when destination seemed impossibly distant, and when turning back seemed more rational than persisting. Both depended on leadership that maintained confidence when confidence should rationally have failed. Both demonstrated that reaching objectives required more than knowing where objectives were, required also surviving the journey and arriving at destination with strength sufficient to accomplish purposes that had motivated journey in first place. The compass that pointed toward hunger being also compass that pointed toward Quebec, the instrument being neutral and humans being ones who chose to follow its indication despite costs, the direction being chosen and the suffering that direction entailed being accepted, because alternative of abandoning purpose was unacceptable even when continuing toward purpose was nearly impossible. The compass, the direction, the hunger, forever pointing north, forever pointing inward, forever the navigation that succeeded and failed simultaneously. Forever. Quebec's fortifications rose from cliff top overlooking the St. Lawrence. Massive construction of stone and earth built over century and a half to defend what was then French colony's capital, and what was now British stronghold controlling access to continental interior. Walls that had witnessed sieges before, and that in November 1775 waited for Arnold's expedition with silent confidence that came from mass and height, and the simple physical fact that stone could not be quickly overcome without artillery that Americans did not possess. We begin with Arnold's force finally reaching the river opposite Quebec in mid-November, the view across the water showing walls that were more formidable than maps had suggested, ramparts that crowned natural defenses of cliff and river, the fortress that was expedition's objective revealing itself as achievement that seemed impossible when viewed by men who were weakened by 2 months of wilderness ordeal, who numbered now perhaps 600 combat-effective soldiers from the 1,100 who had departed Fort Western, who lacked siege artillery and adequate supplies, and the military infrastructure that taking fortified cities required. The goal that had been clear on maps becoming unclear when viewed from river's southern bank, with understanding that reaching walls and taking them were entirely different challenges. The crossing of the St. Lawrence had to wait. Arnold needed boats and favorable conditions and darkness to conceal movement from British observers on walls. The days passing while arrangements were made, and while British garrison watched American preparations, defenders knowing that attack was coming but not knowing when or from which direction. The waiting being psychological warfare, where British confidence in walls' strength opposed American determination to attempt impossible. When crossing finally occurred in early November darkness, it was achieved without significant losses. Boats shuttled soldiers across river mile wide, landing them at Wolfe's Cove, where British had landed 16 years earlier during campaign that had taken Quebec from French. The historical resonance being noted by those who knew history, and who wondered whether this expedition would replicate British success, or would join list of failed attempts to take fortress that geography and engineering had made nearly impregnable. It is said that garrison was smaller than it should have been. Many British regulars had departed for Boston before Arnold's approach was known, leaving Quebec defended by mixture of British troops and Canadian militia and sailors from ships frozen in harbor for winter. Perhaps 1,800 defenders in total, which was less than fortress could have held, and less than fortress needed for defense to be certain. The numerical balance being closer to equal than it would have been if garrison had been at full strength, giving Americans hope that surprise and audacity might overcome advantages that walls provided to defenders. But hope based on numerical calculations overlooked reality that walls multiplied defenders' effectiveness. That one man behind stone rampart was worth several men attacking across open ground. That taking fortified positions required either overwhelming force or artillery or time for formal siege operations, none of which Americans possessed in adequate measure. We descend into the American encampment south and west of Quebec, the positions on Plains of Abraham and in suburbs outside walls. The inadequate shelter that exposed soldiers to cold that was intensifying as November became December. The supplies that were insufficient for sustaining force through winter siege. Even if habitants were willing to sell provisions, which many were not because they were unsure whether Americans would win, and because supporting losing side meant punishment when British reasserted control. The waiting began, Arnold hoping for Montgomery's arrival with artillery and reinforcements from Montreal, hoping for surrender negotiations that never came, hoping for circumstances to shift in ways that would make assault feasible. The weeks passing while defenders strengthened walls, and while American force weakened through exposure and through supply shortages, and through the demoralization that came from sitting outside walls, they could not take looking at objective they could not achieve. The siege that was not actually siege, because Americans lacked resources to conduct formal siege operations, but was instead blockade that was more symbolic than effective, because it could not prevent supplies from reaching defenders, and could not compel surrender through isolation. The walls dominated everything their presence shaped: where Americans could safely camp, how they could move, what they could attempt. The stone ramparts being enemy more formidable than British soldiers, because walls did not tire or require supplies or suffer from cold, were simply there being obstacle that humans had built, but that now seemed natural feature of landscape, permanent and immovable, and silently asserting that taking Quebec would require overcoming what could not be overcome with resources available to expedition. The psychological weight of walls was substantial. Soldiers looking at them understood that assault would be suicidal unless circumstances were perfect, that stone and height and defenders with muskets and cannon made direct attack almost certain to fail, that their presence outside Quebec might demonstrate American determination, but would not achieve military objectives unless something changed. Unless Montgomery arrived with means to make assault feasible, or unless defenders chose to negotiate, which they showed no signs of doing. Whispers tell us of messages exchanged, Arnold sending demands for surrender accompanied by threats of what would follow if surrender was refused. British commander refusing demands with contempt that was barely veiled, making clear that he considered American force insufficient to threaten fortress seriously. That walls made Quebec safe regardless of how many ill-equipped colonials camped outside. The exchange of messages being ritual that both sides understood would not produce surrender, but that had to be performed because military custom demanded it. The refusal being expected, but being also demoralizing, because it confirmed what Americans already suspected, which was that taking Quebec would require more than demand and determination, would require military capacity that they did not possess. We witnessed the cold intensifying as December arrived, the temperatures dropping below freezing and staying there. Snow beginning to fall with regularity. Winter arriving on schedule regardless of military operations. The season that Americans had hoped to avoid becoming the season they would have to endure, because retreat now would mean abandoning everything that had been suffered for, would mean admitting that expedition had failed completely rather than partially, would mean returning to colonies without having achieved anything except casualty lists and stories of hardship. The choice being between continuing despite growing impossibility, or retreating while retreat was still possible. Neither option being good, but continuation being chosen, because failure was not yet complete, and because hope that Montgomery's arrival would change situation remained alive, even as circumstances suggested that hope was increasingly unjustified. We sit with the silence of the walls, the stone that said nothing, but that communicated everything. The ramparts that did not need to threaten because their existence was threat sufficient. The walls that held winter's silence because stone and winter were allied in making assault nearly impossible. Cold being barrier as effective as stone, because soldiers who were freezing could not fight effectively, and soldiers who had inadequate shelter could not maintain strength needed for assault that would require climbing walls or breaking through gates. The alliance between fortifications and season-creating defense that was more than sum of its parts. Walls being stronger because winter made attackers weaker. Winter being more dangerous because walls prevented Americans from finding adequate shelter. The combination creating situation where time worked against attackers, and where every day of waiting reduced chances of success, while increasing inevitability of either retreat or disaster. We reflect on walls as human attempts to control space, and to define inside and outside, us and them, safety and danger, the fortifications at Quebec being statements in stone about power and permanence, British authority being asserted through construction that had taken decades, and that represented investment of resources and labor that colonies could not match. Walls testifying that empire had advantages beyond military skill or political legitimacy, had also sheer material capacity to build infrastructure that resisted challenges, the stone being empire's answer to revolution's ideas, mass being response to enthusiasm, permanence being reply to uprising, the walls saying that regardless of whether revolutionary cause was just or whether British rule was oppressive, the physical reality was that empire had built walls and revolution had not yet built capacity to overcome them. We close with walls standing in falling snow, American camp visible from ramparts, defenders watching attackers who watched defenders, stalemate developing where neither side could force resolution, where Americans could not take Quebec and British could not drive Americans away, but where time favored defenders because walls provided shelter, and because relief was coming in spring, while Americans faced winter without adequate supplies or protection. The walls holding their silence because stone did not need to speak, the ramparts testifying through their presence that taking Quebec would require more than audacity, would require resources and time and luck that Arnold's expedition had exhausted during Wilderness March. The stone walls that held winter's silence being also walls that held American hopes at bay, that made dreams of 14th colony seem like fantasies when viewed from outside in cold, while defenders watched from inside in comparative warmth. The walls forever standing, forever silent, forever testimony to what revolution could not yet overcome. Forever. New Year's Eve 1775 brought the snowstorm that American commanders had calculated they needed, dense falling snow that would conceal approach to Quebec's walls, wind that would muffle sound of movement, weather that would reduce visibility to arm's length, and would give attackers advantage of surprise that clear conditions would deny them. Nature appearing to offer what humans lacked, which was concealment for assault on fortress, whose walls were too strong to take by direct attack in daylight, but which might be breached if approach could be made undetected, and if defenders could be surprised in sectors where walls were weakest. We begin in the pre-dawn darkness of December 31st, when columns formed in the storm Montgomery's force approaching from southwest, where it had been positioned since arriving from Montreal with small cannons and several hundred additional soldiers, Arnold's force preparing to approach from north through suburb of St. Roch. The plan requiring simultaneous attacks on Lower Town that would draw defenders down from Upper Town and would create confusion that main assault could exploit. Coordination being essential, but coordination being nearly impossible in blizzard, that made communication between widely separated forces extremely difficult. Timing that had to be precise being left largely to chance, and to hope that both commanders would judge conditions correctly and would launch attacks at moments that would allow mutual support. The strategy was desperation born from necessity. Months of waiting outside Quebec had not produced surrender. Formal siege was impossible without artillery and engineering resources that Americans lacked. The approaching spring would bring British reinforcements that would make any assault suicidal. The calculation being that attempting to take Quebec during winter storm was long shot, but that not attempting meant certain failure when relief fleet arrived. Better to risk everything on improbable assault than to wait passively for situation to become impossible. Montgomery had reluctance about plan, was experienced enough to recognize how much could go wrong, understood that attacking fortified positions in blizzard required luck as much as planning, but was also committed to attempting something rather than retreating without having seriously challenged defenders. His agreement to assault being compromise between military judgment that said attack was unwise and political reality that said some attempt had to be made. It is said that columns moved through snow that was already knee-deep and deepening soldiers wading through drifts toward positions where assault would begin. Cold that was intense enough that exposed skin froze within minutes. Wind driving ice crystals into faces until features were numb, and until seeing was difficult even with visibility that blizzard allowed. Weapons being concerned, because musket priming powder had to be kept dry, and because snow infiltrated every space and wetted powder that was supposed to ignite, making firearms unreliable and forcing reliance on bayonets, and on getting close enough to defenders that muskets that did fire would be effective at point-blank range. The advance was blind soldiers following leaders who followed routes memorized during reconnaissance, or who followed intuition about where they were in whiteout conditions that made landmarks invisible. The coordination between separated columns being hopeful assumption rather than confirmed reality, because communication was impossible once forces were committed. We descend into Montgomery's approach the column, advancing along River Road toward Barricade, where defenders had positioned cannon covering the approach, Montgomery leading from front in position that was courageous. But that was also dangerous because front position made him most exposed to fire, the advance proceeding slowly through storm, until they reached obstacle where defenders waited, having been alerted by sounds of approach that wind did not completely muffle. The moment of contact coming when defenders fired cannon loaded with grape shot at point-blank range into column that was compressed into narrow space between cliff and river. Blast that killed Montgomery instantly along with his top aides, decapitating command and stopping assault before it developed beyond initial approach. Montgomery's death creating chaos in column that had already been disorganized by blizzard, and that now lost leadership that might have rallied them and pushed assault forward despite casualties. The column fragmenting and withdrawing, leaving Montgomery's body in snow, where it would remain until defenders recovered it. His death becoming defining moment of assault that had been planned to take Quebec, but that instead demonstrated how desperately undermanned and undersupplied American force was. Simultaneously, Arnold's column was fighting through streets of Lower Town, the approach from north taking different route and encountering different obstacles, but facing similar challenges of navigating in blizzard and of overcoming defenses that had been prepared against precisely this kind of attack. Arnold himself being wounded in leg early in assault by musket ball that shattered bone, and that removed him from action. Command passing to Daniel Morgan, who was rifleman from Virginia, whose reputation for toughness and whose personal courage pushed assault forward with fury born from months of frustration and hardship. Morgan leading soldiers who forced their way past first barricade, and who captured British soldiers, and who pressed toward second barricade at far end of Lower Town, believing that they were succeeding, not knowing that Montgomery was dead and his column had withdrawn, not understanding that they were now isolated, and that continued advance was not breakthrough, but was trap that was closing. We witnessed the fighting in streets, the close-quarters combat, in conditions where visibility was so limited that combatants saw each other only when they were within steps of contact. The musket fire being sporadic because weapons were wet, and because powder was contaminated by snow, fighting devolving into hand-to-hand struggles with bayonets and clubbed weapons. Americans pressing forward through sheer determination, while British and Canadian defenders fought to contain penetration that threatened to split defenses. The battle lasting hours, but being ultimately contained when British reinforcements came from Upper Town, where no assault had materialized because Montgomery's force had been stopped before reaching their objective. The trap closing as defenders surrounded Morgan's force in streets where they had advanced. Ammunition running out and cold making continued fighting impossible, the choice becoming surrender or death. Morgan weeping with rage as he offered sword to captors. Hundreds of Americans becoming prisoners, including most of Arnold's officers. The blizzard continued through the night and into New Year's Day, snow falling on battlefield where Montgomery lay dead, on streets where American prisoners were being collected, on camps outside walls where survivors struggled back carrying wounded and carrying knowledge that assault had failed catastrophically. That hope of taking Quebec by bold stroke had died with Montgomery, and with capture of hundreds of soldiers who were now prisoners. Whether that was supposed to conceal attack having also concealed coordination failures, and having made confusion inevitable. Storm being ally that proved to be enemy, because while it provided cover, it also prevented effective command and made mutual support between separated columns impossible. The blizzard carrying on its wings not victory but defeat, delivering not surprise but disaster. Being indifferent to which side it aided because weather recognized no allegiances and made no judgments except its own continuation. We sit with the aftermath visible when storm cleared the American force that had numbered perhaps 2,000 before assault reduced by hundreds captured and dozens killed. Siege that had been ineffective before assault becoming pointless afterward, because attacking force was now too small to threaten fortress. Even if circumstances permitted another attempt, which they did not. Montgomery's death removing capable commander and Arnold's wound removing other leader. Command falling to officers who had not led expedition and who faced situation that was militarily hopeless. Choice being whether to maintain presence outside Quebec, hoping that something would change, or to retreat, while retreat was still possible before spring brought British reinforcements that would make any American presence untenable. We reflect on storms as chaos that humans try to utilize, but cannot control, the blizzard being weather phenomenon that Americans hoped would favor them. But that proved to be neutral force creating difficulties for both sides, but creating more difficulties for attackers who needed coordination and visibility, and dry powder, than for defenders who had walls and prepared positions and advantage of fighting in familiar ground. The assumption that storm would aid assault being error that came from desperation, and from belief that nature could be ally when nature was actually indifferent. snow and wind serving no purpose except their own, and affecting human plans only incidentally. The blizzard being force of nature that humans attempted to incorporate into military strategy, and that demonstrated through its effects that natural forces could not be reliably predicted or controlled or bent to serve purposes that were exclusively human. We close contemplating defeat carried on blizzard's wings, the storm that was supposed to conceal American approach, instead concealing the disorganization and the failures of coordination. The snow that was supposed to provide tactical advantage, instead making weapons unreliable, and making movement difficult, and making survival itself challenging. The weather that was supposed to be opening through which assault could succeed instead being closing through which hopes fled, and were dispersed like snow driven by wind. The blizzard being both medium and message, both concealer and revealer, both hoped for ally and actual enemy, carrying defeat on wings that were invisible but powerful, delivering truth that assault could not succeed with resources available, and in conditions that made coordination impossible, the storm forever linked to assault's failure, forever testimony to limits of what courage could achieve without adequate preparation and resources and luck, forever blowing, forever concealing and revealing, forever indifferent, forever the blizzard that carried defeat on its wings, forever. Beyond Quebec's walls, in camps that American forces maintained through January and February and March after the failed New Year's assault, an enemy arrived that was more deadly than British muskets or Canadian militia, or the stone fortifications that had withstood every attempt to breach them. Smallpox, establishing itself in crowded tents, where soldiers lived in conditions that disease found ideal for spreading, pestilence moving through weakened bodies, with efficiency that no military strategy could match, killing Americans faster than combat ever would, and destroying military effectiveness more completely than any defeat in battle could destroy it. We begin with first cases appearing in January. Soldiers developing the characteristic fever and headache that preceded eruption of pustules. The initial cases being isolated enough that they might have been contained if Army had possessed knowledge and resources for quarantine. But knowledge of disease transmission was limited to vague notions about bad air and contagion, and resources were non-existent in camps where soldiers already lived in crowded conditions, and where separating sick from healthy would have required shelter and supplies that did not exist. The disease arriving and finding circumstances perfectly suited to its propagation, weakness from cold and hunger making soldiers vulnerable to infection, crowding making exposure inevitable, inadequate medical knowledge making treatment ineffective. The recognition that smallpox had come brought fear that was different from fear of combat. British soldiers could be fought with weapons and tactics. Stone walls could theoretically be overcome with artillery and siegecraft. But disease was enemy that could not be engaged directly, that killed without offering opportunity for resistance or courage or tactical brilliance to make difference. Pestilence being implacable in ways that human enemies were not, because disease had no morale to break and no supplies to cut and no strategy to counter, simply existed and spread and killed according to biological imperatives that humans barely understood and could not effectively combat with 18th century medical knowledge. The officers recognized that smallpox threatened to destroy army more completely than British defenders could, the disease spreading exponentially as infected soldiers passed contagion to others before symptoms appeared. The time lag between exposure and illness, meaning that quarantine measures were always implemented too late to prevent next wave of infections. The mathematics of epidemic progression working against every effort to contain it. It is said that variolation was debated, the practice of deliberately infecting people with matter from smallpox pustules, in hopes of producing mild case that would confer immunity, technique that was known, and that had been used successfully in some contexts. But that was controversial because it sometimes caused severe illness or death, because it required infecting healthy people during epidemic when infection was spreading naturally anyway, because it demanded resources and medical supervision that army camps could not provide. The decision about whether to attempt variolation being complicated by these practical and ethical considerations, and by fact that epidemic was already well established by time debate occurred, making variolation program of questionable value when significant portion of force was already infected, or would be infected before variolation could take effect. We descend into the surgeon's tent, the medical facility being generous term for space where sick were gathered, canvas shelter that offered minimal protection from cold, pallets on ground where feverish soldiers lay in various stages of disease progression, the characteristic pustules that marked smallpox covering faces and bodies of those who had reached that stage, the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies, and the latrines that were too close to shelter. Sounds of coughing and moaning, and the labored breathing of those whose lungs were affected by disease, or by secondary infections that took advantage of weakened immune systems. The surgeons who attended sick possessed medical knowledge that was primitive by later standards, understanding of disease causation being based on theories about humors and miasmas. Treatments ranging from bleeding to purging to administration of mercury. Interventions that were as likely to harm as to help, and that certainly could not cure viral infection that medicine would not understand for another century. The medical care being mostly provision of comfort and of basic nursing rather than actual treatment. Keeping patients warm and fed and clean being most effective interventions available, but being difficult to accomplish in camps where supplies were inadequate, and where keeping anyone warm was challenge. The dying happened throughout winter, soldiers succumbing to disease at rate that exceeded casualties from all combat during campaign, bodies being carried out of surgeons' tent daily to be buried in ground that was frozen, and that required great labor to excavate, graves being shallow because digging deep was impossible in January frost, the dead being wrapped in blankets because coffins were unavailable, burial being quick because cold preserved bodies, but also because multiple deaths daily meant that elaborate ceremonies were impractical. The accumulation of dead testifying to disease's effectiveness as killer, and to the helplessness of army that could do nothing to stop spread, or to save more than small fraction of those who contracted severe cases. Whispers tell us of how disease transformed the siege, the American force that had numbered over 2,000 in December, diminishing through January and February, as soldiers died, or became too sick to perform duties or recovered, but were weakened and unable to resume full activity. The effective combat strength dropping below levels where maintaining siege made military sense. The operation that had been military campaign becoming humanitarian disaster, where keeping soldiers alive was more challenging than threatening British positions. Officers calculating whether to continue siege, knowing that every day of continuation meant more disease transmission, or whether to retreat and abandon hope of taking Quebec, but potentially save lives by ending exposure to conditions that fostered epidemic. The supply situation worsened as disease spread. Soldiers who were sick could not forage for provisions. Resources had to be diverted to caring for sick rather than to military operations. Habitants became increasingly reluctant to sell supplies to Americans when it became known that smallpox was raging in camps, because contact with infected soldiers meant risk of disease spreading to civilian populations. The isolation that disease created compounding other problems and accelerating armies' disintegration. We witnessed the choices disease forced. Montgomery was dead from New Year's assault. Arnold was recovering from wound and was unable to physically command, though he maintained nominal authority. Command falling to officers who faced decisions that had no good options: whether to maintain presence outside Quebec, hoping that something would change, or to retreat, while retreat was still possible, though retreat meant admitting total failure. Whether to accept reinforcements that Congress was sending, which would bring fresh troops, but which would also bring soldiers who had not been exposed to smallpox, and who would likely contract disease upon joining infected camps. Whether continuing campaign was militarily justifiable, when disease was destroying army faster than British action could destroy it. Calculations that balanced abstract strategic consideration against concrete reality of soldiers dying from pestilence daily. The mathematics producing different answers, depending on whether one prioritized mission objectives or human costs. We sit with the surgeon's tent at night, lantern light casting shadows on canvas walls. Faces of sick soldiers visible in dim illumination, showing suffering that words could inadequately describe. The sounds of labored breathing and of occasional cries when pain broke through exhaustion. The smell that was distinctive and that was nauseating, but that surgeon and orderlies were accustomed to through familiarity. The presence of death being tangible in ways that made tent feel like threshold between life and whatever came after life. The understanding among those who worked there that most who entered in advanced stages of disease would not leave alive. The tent being place where revolutionary ideology met biological reality, and where ideals about liberty confronted simple truth that bodies were fragile, and that disease recognized no political allegiances, and made no distinctions between patriots and loyalists, because virus had no politics and no cause except its own replication. We reflect on disease as enemy that exposed limits of human control. Armies could be fought with tactics and weapons. Fortifications could be besieged with engineering and artillery. But epidemic could not be defeated with military means. Required medical knowledge that was centuries away from being developed, and public health infrastructure that did not exist in 18th century military camps. The smallpox epidemic at Quebec being testimony to how vulnerable humans were to microscopic enemies they could not see, and could not understand, and could barely fight. the disease being equalizer that made revolutionary fervor and British authority equally irrelevant, because both sides were vulnerable to pestilence, though Americans suffered more, because their camps were more crowded, and because their soldiers were more weakened by previous hardships, and because British garrison had walls that provided better shelter and had supplies that were more adequate for maintaining health. We close insurgents' tent as winter deepened, new cases arriving daily, deaths continuing without pause, the whisper of smallpox being not mysterious voice, but being labored breathing of dying men, being sound of suffering that medical care could ease but could not eliminate, being testimony to biological forces that were more powerful than human will or courage or determination. The tent holding not just sick, but also truth that some enemies could not be fought with weapons, that some battles could not be won through tactics or through sacrifice, that disease was force of nature that required different responses than military threats required, responses that American Army at Quebec did not have resources or knowledge to implement effectively. The surgeon's tent where smallpox whispered being place, where campaigns' failure became inevitable not through British military action, but through biological catastrophe that Americans could not prevent or contain or overcome. The whisper being also requiem for hopes of taking Quebec, for dreams of 14th colony, for expedition that had marched through wilderness and had endured winter siege only to be destroyed by enemy that required microscope to see, and that would not be truly understood for generations yet to come. Forever whispering, forever killing, forever the tent where smallpox spoke louder than cannons, forever. Throughout the winter siege at Quebec, soldiers wrote letters home when paper and ink and opportunity coincided messages carried by those who departed camps through discharge, or through desertion, or through military necessity of carrying dispatches southward. Correspondence that described conditions in terms calculated to inform without alarming excessively. Letters that traveled hundreds of miles through winter landscape while writers remained or died outside fortress walls. Paper testimonies to relationships maintained across distance, and to gap between what could be written and what was experienced. Words surviving when those who wrote them sometimes did not. We begin with the act of writing in winter camp soldiers, using whatever paper they could obtain, which was scarce commodity in army that lacked basic supplies. Ink that sometimes froze before letters could be completed, requiring thawing before writing could resume. The physical challenge of writing with cold-stiffened fingers while wearing gloves or mittens that made holding pen difficult. The literacy that varied widely, with some soldiers being fluent writers, while others struggled to form letters and compose sentences. The gap between facility with written language and facility with spoken language, creating situations where what soldiers wanted to say exceeded their capacity to write it clearly. The content of letters reflected both honesty and censorship, descriptions of weather and daily routines being safe subjects that could be written without fear of officers reading and disapproving. Expressions of hope for eventual success, and for return home being expected, sentiments that reassured families while also maintaining soldiers' reputation among comrades who might read letters before they were sent. Silence about disease and about casualty rates being sometimes required by military censorship, and sometimes chosen by soldiers who understood that truth would devastate families who could do nothing to help, and who would suffer from knowing without being able to act. The lies of omission were kindnesses, or were recognitions that whole truth could not be conveyed through letters that would be read weeks or months after circumstances had changed. That news of hardship sent in January would arrive in March, when original situation had either improved or worsened, and when information was outdated regardless. The delay between writing and receiving creating disconnect that made letters simultaneously valuable as communication and inadequate as representation of current reality. It is said that soldiers' handwriting changed over winter. Early letters showing relatively neat script, suggesting writers who were healthy and who had time to compose carefully. Later letters becoming shakier and less legible as cold and hunger and disease weakened hands that held pens. The physical deterioration being visible in penmanship that became increasingly difficult to read. The letters themselves becoming testimony to hardship through the way they were written as much as through what they said. Families who received multiple letters being able to see through progression of handwriting how conditions were affecting their soldiers, even when words claimed that everything was manageable. Some letters were dictated to more literate comrades, soldiers who could not write, having friends write for them. The dictation creating distance between thought and expression, as words passed through intermediary. The letters signed with X marks, or with laboriously drawn signatures that were only identifiable marks illiterate soldiers could make. The assistance being common enough that receiving letter written in unfamiliar hand did not necessarily mean anything ominous, though it might mean that soldier was too sick or too injured to write personally. we descend into letters that were never sent, found in pockets of dead soldiers, or in possessions of those who died before letters could be posted, final messages that remained undelivered, words representing last connections to homes and families that writers would not see again, but that they addressed in final communications. The unsent letters being discovered by comrades who went through belongings of deceased looking for valuables or for information about next of kin. Finding letters that raised questions about whether they should be sent to families as last messages from lost soldiers, or whether sending letters that might have been drafts never intended for delivery would cause pain without providing comfort. The drafts that soldiers wrote but revised or discarded showed different side of correspondence, the honest expressions of fear or despair or homesickness that were written, but then deemed inappropriate for sending. The versions that said, "I don't think I will survive," or "This place is killing us," or "I wish I had never volunteered," that were set aside in favor of versions that said, "We face challenges but maintain hope," or "Conditions are difficult but our cause is just." The censored thoughts existing on paper that would be found after death, and that provided windows into internal states that official letters concealed. Whispers tell us of specific stories letters told the soldier carrying letter from wife announcing birth of child he would never meet. The announcement describing infant's name and health, and the mother's recovery, expressing hope that father would return soon to see child who had been born while father was away. The profound disconnection between life beginning at home and life ending at Quebec being represented in single letter that remained in pocket when soldier died from smallpox. The child growing up without father, and without father's knowledge that child existed since he died before letter about birth was written, or before it reached him. The soldier carrying multiple letters from sweetheart showing progression from confidence to anxiety to anger as months passed without response. The letters representing relationship dissolving through distance and silence. The young woman writing with increasing desperation asking why he had not replied, and had he forgotten her, and was he alive or dead? The final letters being accusations that he must have found someone else, or had simply abandoned her. The collection of letters in soldiers' possession testifying that he had received them, and had perhaps meant to respond, but had not done so, or had sent responses that never reached her. The relationship ending through failure of communication before it ended through death that made ending permanent. We witness letters arriving at destinations, families receiving news that was weeks or months old by time. Letters were delivered, learning that loved ones were alive as of letter's date, but having no information about intervening time between writing and receiving. The joy of receiving letter being mixed with anxiety about what had happened since letter was written. Waiting for subsequent letters that would provide updates, or that might never come if soldier died, or if mail system failed, or if soldier simply stopped writing. Reading between lines of cheerful phrases to find hints of actual conditions. Understanding through what was not said as much as through what was said that situation was more difficult than soldier was willing to explicitly state. Families becoming skilled at interpreting silences and at reading meanings in word choices, and in details that soldiers included or omitted. We sit with soldiers who waited for letters from home, the mail arriving irregularly when it arrived at all. Distributions being events that transformed camp atmosphere, as those who received letters read them eagerly, while those who received nothing watched with envy and worry. The randomness of mail delivery, meaning that receiving no letter did not necessarily mean none had been sent, but only that none had arrived in this delivery. The uncertainty creating anxiety about whether families were well or whether something had happened that prevented them from writing. Soldiers composing scenarios in absence of information that ranged from optimistic to catastrophic. The waiting for news from home being as difficult as families waiting for news from Quebec. Both sides experiencing distance and delay and uncertainty about others' condition. Some soldiers never received mail, whether because families did not write, or because letters were lost in transit, or because addresses were incorrect or changed as Army moved. The absence of letters being isolation that compounded physical isolation from home. Soldiers without mail feeling forgot or feeling that connection had been severed. The letters that others received being reminders of what they were missing. We reflect on letters as technology of connection across distance, paper and ink being means of maintaining relationships when physical presence was impossible. Writing being act of reaching across miles, and across weeks or months of delay, to touch person who was separated by space and time. Letters being inadequate substitutes for conversation, but being only substitutes available in era before telegraph or telephone or email. The writing and reading being rituals that maintained connections that distance strained. The physical letter being tangible proof that writer existed and had thought of recipient. That relationship continued even when conditions made continuation difficult. The limitations of letters were visible in delays, and in restrictions on what could be said, and in failures of delivery, and in simple fact that complex emotions and experiences resisted reduction to words on page. But inadequacy did not prevent letters from being treasured, and from being read repeatedly, and from being carried as talismans representing home and family and life that soldiers hoped to return to if they survived. We close contemplating letter found in pocket of frozen soldier paper, preserved by cold that killed carrier. Ink still legible months after death. Words written by wife or parent or child, still readable and still carrying meanings that sender intended, and that recipient had read perhaps many times before succumbing to disease or to cold or to wounds. Letter that had been last connection to home, that had survived when soldier did not, that testified to love, that was real even when person loved died, before love could be fulfilled through reunion. The letter might eventually be returned to sender with notification of death, the paper traveling back to origin accompanying news that recipient was gone, the letter that was sent as connection becoming memorial, words that were meant to maintain relationship, until reunion being instead final communication from soldier who would not return. The circularity of letters journey mirroring the incomplete circle of soldiers' journey from home to Quebec, and then not back, but only paper returning while soldier remained in unmarked grave far from home. The letters that traveled farther than their writers being testimony to human need for connection, and to inadequacy of connection when separation is permanent, to words that persist when voices are silenced, to paper that survives when flesh does not, to love that was expressed and preserved but that could not overcome distance and disease and death that ended relationships that letters tried to sustain. Forever traveling, forever testimony, forever inadequate and precious simultaneously. Forever the letters that traveled farther than their writers. Forever. May 1776 witnessed the breaking of ice on the St. Lawrence, the river that had been frozen solid through winter becoming navigable again, as temperatures rose, and as solid surface that had sealed Quebec off from Atlantic dissolved into floating flows that moved with current. The seasonal transformation being natural process that occurred every year regardless of human events, but that had profound military consequences in 1776, because it opened water route for British relief fleet carrying reinforcements and supplies that would transform defenders' position from defensive patience to offensive capability. The thaw that Americans had dreaded arriving exactly when it was expected, bringing with it the end of hopes and the beginning of retreat that would undo all that winter's suffering had tried to achieve. We begin with ice breakup, the sound of cracking that echoed across valley as warming temperatures weakened frozen river surface. The massive flows that broke free and moved downstream. The transformation from solid surface that could be walked across to flowing water that could carry ships, happening over days in April and early May. Nature's calendar marking transition from winter campaign season to spring campaign season, when operations that ice had prevented became possible again. The thaw being liberation for defenders and disaster for Americans who understood that their time had expired, that the siege that had been maintained through winter despite smallpox and starvation would have to end now that British reinforcements could reach Quebec by water. The American commanders understood what thaw meant, had known since New Year's disaster that taking Quebec by assault was impossible with depleted forces and without artillery adequate for breaching walls, had maintained presence outside fortress through winter, partly from hope that something would change and partly from inability to decide whether retreating without accomplishing anything was worse than staying and accomplishing nothing, while losing soldiers to disease daily. The thaw-forcing decision that had been postponed, because thaw meant British reinforcements were coming and staying to face them, would mean destruction of American force that was already reduced to perhaps 1,000 combat-effective soldiers from the 3,000 who had been at Quebec in December before smallpox began its killing. The debate about retreat had happened throughout March and April, some arguing that maintaining siege was pointless when disease was destroying army faster than siege was affecting defenders. Others arguing that retreating meant admitting complete failure and abandoning wounded and sick who could not travel. The arguments producing no consensus until thaw made continued presence untenable. It is said that first British ships appeared in early May, the vessels that had departed England in March or April, carrying several thousand British regulars and German mercenaries, bringing artillery and supplies and professional military capacity that would overwhelm American militia forces that were weakened and diseased and demoralized. The appearance of ships being visible from American camps and being final signal that retreat could not be delayed further, that staying meant being trapped and destroyed, that the campaign which had begun in September optimism was ending in May catastrophe. 9 months of suffering producing nothing except casualties and lessons about hubris. The preparations for withdrawal were hurried equipment that could not be carried being destroyed or abandoned. The few siege guns that had been dragged to Quebec with enormous effort being spiked, so they could not be used by British, or being dumped in river. Supplies being destroyed because transporting them was impossible, and leaving them intact meant providing resources to pursuers. The systematic dismantling of siege works and camps happening in atmosphere of panic, barely controlled by officers who understood that delay meant disaster. We descend into the question of what to do with sick, the hundreds of soldiers who were too ill with smallpox or with other diseases to travel, who would slow retreat to pace that would allow British to overtake and destroy column, whose presence in retreating force would also spread disease to civilians in communities along route, and would potentially infect reinforcements that were supposedly coming from colonies to replace losses. The decision was made to leave sick in care of habitants and of religious orders that operated hospitals, the wounded and diseased being left behind with whatever supplies could be spared, and with payments in continental currency that had uncertain value, officers writing pleas to habitants, and to nuns asking for Christian charity toward men who had fought for liberty, and who now needed mercy that Americans could not provide because military necessity demanded retreat at speed that sick could not match. The leaving behind of comrades created guilt among those who continued understanding that sick were being abandoned to fates that might include death or might include recovery, but that certainly included period of vulnerability, when they would be at mercy of British who might treat them as prisoners or might simply ignore them, the abandonment being necessary, but being also violation of military code that said soldiers did not abandon wounded, and that units stayed together. The necessity overriding code, because staying meant destruction of entire force, rather than just loss of those who could not travel. The retreat began in haste, the American force fragmenting as disease and exhaustion prevented unified movement, different units departing at different times and traveling at different paces. The organization that had never been strong dissolving entirely as campaign ended not with ordered withdrawal, but with flight that was barely controlled. Soldiers moving south retracing route they had approached by but now moving as desperate individuals rather than as military force. The pursuit by British regulars being limited because British commanders recognized that following too closely meant entering areas where smallpox was prevalent, and meant risking disease spreading to their own forces. The Americans being saved from complete destruction, primarily by disease, they carried which made close pursuit dangerous to pursuers. The pestilence that had destroyed American army also protecting remnants from annihilation by making them too diseased to safely attack. Whispers tell us of the path of retreat soldiers deserting or dying, or being captured, as force moved south through Quebec territory into St. Lawrence Valley, and eventually back toward Lake Champlain and Crown Point, where American defensive positions might provide some security. The retreat taking weeks and leaving trail of abandoned equipment and shallow graves. The survivors who eventually reached Ticonderoga, numbering perhaps several hundred combat-effective soldiers from the several thousand who had participated in campaign at various stages. The losses being measured not just in dead, but in captured and in deserters, and in those who were so weakened by disease and hardship that they could not resume military service for months. The army that had besieged Quebec dissolving on march south, leaving only fragments that would require complete rebuilding before they could function militarily again. We witness the British relief, the garrison that had endured siege being reinforced and resupplied, the danger passing as American force fled, Quebec remaining British stronghold and Canada remaining British territory. The campaign that was supposed to make Canada 14th colony having accomplished nothing, except demonstrating that American forces were not yet capable of conducting operations at distances from their supply bases, and against fortified positions that required professional military capacity that militia forces lacked, the failure being complete and being obvious to everyone including to Congress, which would not authorize another attempt to take Quebec. The northern frontier, remaining where it had been before campaign, began with Americans having lost thousands of soldiers, and having gained nothing except knowledge that some objectives were beyond their current capability. We sit with the thaw as natural phenomenon that became historical marker, the breaking of ice being annual event that had occurred for centuries and would continue occurring regardless of human events, but that in 1776 became the moment when American campaign ended, and when British reinforcement began, nature's timing being indifferent to military plans, and making no adjustments for human convenience. The river flowing and freezing and thawing according to seasonal patterns that humans could predict but could not alter, the thaw being simultaneously liberation and disaster, depending on which side one was on, bringing relief to British and sorrow to Americans, the same natural process having opposite meanings for different observers, the neutrality of nature being visible in how ice melted without regard for which army it aided by melting. We reflect on campaigns that are defeated by seasons as much as by enemies, the timing of operations being constrained by weather and by natural cycles that set limits on what could be attempted, and when it could be attempted, winter being enemy that killed more Americans than British muskets killed, spring being relief that came too late to save American campaign, but exactly on time to save British garrison. The seasons being framework within which human plans had to fit or fail. The attempt to fight winter campaign in Canada being error that experience might have prevented if planners had understood how difficult maintaining forces in field through Canadian winter would be. The thaw being nature's verdict that time had expired, and that siege was over regardless of whether either side was ready for conclusion. We close beside river in May, sunshine, ice gone, water flowing freely, carrying first British ships toward Quebec, American camps visible but empty as force retreated south. The thaw bringing salvation to British and sorrow to Americans who had endured winter only to lose everything when spring came. The season's change being both liberation from ice and confirmation of defeat. Nature being indifferent to which side benefited from transition from frozen to flowing. The river continuing as it always had regardless of human dramas played out along its banks. Quebec's walls standing as they had stood before Americans came, and as they would stand after Americans left. The spring thaw bringing not renewal but ending, not hope but acknowledgement that this campaign had failed completely, that Canada would not join revolution, that northern frontier would remain British, that all the suffering of wilderness march and winter siege had accomplished nothing except casualty lists and lessons about limits. The thaw being moment of truth when ice melted and revealed what had been frozen underneath, the futility, the losses, the sorrow of effort that did not achieve purpose, the spring that came too late to save siege but precisely on time to end it, forever flowing, forever indifferent, forever the thaw that brought ships and sorrow, forever nature's timing superseding human planning, forever the seasonal transition that became historical ending, forever thawing, forever ending, forever the spring that brought relief to some and disaster to others. Forever. The withdrawal from Quebec became second catastrophe, mirroring the first, the wilderness that had been enemy during advance remaining enemy during retreat, the sick who could not march being left inhabitants' care, or dying along roadside, equipment being abandoned as soldiers lacked strength to carry it, order dissolving as military organization gave way to desperate individuals seeking survival, the path southward being marked by discarded possessions and shallow graves, by men who sat down to rest and did not rise again, by systematic shedding of everything except barest necessities of continued movement, the retreat leaving more behind than it carried forward. We begin with the fragmented columns moving south, no longer army in functional sense, but collection of sick and exhausted men who happen to be traveling in same general direction. Officers who no longer commanded because there were no intact units to command. Discipline that had dissolved because circumstances made enforcement impossible and irrelevant. The retreat being each man's personal struggle to reach safety before disease or exhaustion or British pursuit stopped him. The collective retreat being some of individual struggles rather than being coordinated military operation. The distinction between organized withdrawal and panicked flight being blurred, as reality approached closer to flight than to withdrawal, though officers tried to maintain pretense of order that had largely ceased to exist. The leaving behind began immediately the siege artillery that had finally arrived in spring, after months of effort to transport it from Ticonderoga being spiked and abandoned, because horses to pull guns were dead from winter's privations, and because soldiers lacked strength to manhandle heavy pieces along roads, the guns being destroyed so British could not use them, but being left where they had been positioned, because moving them was impossible. The artillery that was supposed to make siege viable being discarded, without ever being used effectively against fortress, it was brought to reduce. The tents and camp equipment were burned or simply left, because carrying them meant slowing retreat, and because destroyed equipment denied resources to British, while abandoned equipment that could not be destroyed at least did not burden retreating soldiers. The systematic elimination of everything not absolutely essential for immediate survival being ruthless calculation about what could be transported versus what had to be discarded. The possessions that soldiers had carried from Massachusetts through Maine wilderness to Quebec being winnowed to almost nothing as strength failed, and as urgency increased. It is said that sick were left at communities along route, soldiers too ill with smallpox to travel being left in French-Canadian villages, with whatever arrangements could be made for their care. Officers paying habitants in continental currency, and appealing to Christian charity and to common humanity, knowing that sick would either recover or die, but that their fates were out of American hands now. The abandoning of sick being necessity that created guilt, But that was unavoidable because moving them meant condemning healthy soldiers to capture or death through slowing retreat to pace that British could easily overtake. The habitants who accepted care of sick American soldiers did so with mixed motives, some from genuine compassion, some from payment offered though currency's value was doubtful, some from religious conviction that caring for sick was Christian duty regardless of nationality or politics, some from simple recognition that refusing meant soldiers would die in their villages regardless, so accepting responsibility at least meant attempting care rather than watching passive death. The sick soldiers left behind faced uncertain futures. Some recovered and eventually made their way back to American lines. Some died in habitants' care and were buried in Quebec. Some were captured by British when garrisons were reinforced and spent war as prisoners, their individual outcomes depending on severity of disease and quality of care and luck, the uncertainty being final cruelty added to suffering already endured. We descend into disintegration of military identity during retreat soldiers, who had defined themselves through unit membership, and through military role losing those identifications as units fragmented, and as military operations gave way to pure survival, men becoming simply individuals trying to live through retreat rather than being members of army attempting to withdraw in good order. The shedding of military equipment and military bearing and military discipline being parallel to physical retreat, the internal transformation from soldier to refugee happening as external journey moved from Quebec toward safety. Some soldiers discarded uniforms and military equipment, deliberately reasoning that civilian clothing and absence of military identification offered better chance of finding food or shelter from habitants who might be sympathetic to French speakers fleeing British but less sympathetic to military forces that brought war to their communities. The blurring of line between army and populace being strategic choice in some cases, and being simply result of disintegration in others. Military identity dissolving, because circumstances made maintaining it pointless or dangerous. Whispers tell us of smallpox continuing its work. During retreat, the disease that had weakened army at Quebec following soldiers as they fled. New cases developing among those who had not yet been infected. Those who had recovered relapsing under stress of retreat. The sick being left at communities along route creating trail of disease that marked retreat's passage, and that would continue killing for months after army had moved on. the pestilence being legacy that retreat left behind along with abandoned equipment and buried dead, disease spreading to civilian populations that had contact with infected soldiers, creating epidemic that would affect Quebec communities for a year or more after campaign ended. The soldiers who were sick but still mobile struggled to keep pace with retreat, knowing that falling behind meant being left, and that being left probably meant death either from disease or from capture. The desperate effort to continue moving despite fever and weakness and pain being testimony to survival instinct that overrode everything else. Some succeeding in keeping pace through sheer determination, and some failing, and being found dead beside route weeks later when summer heat made corpses visible. We witness what was carried versus what was left, soldiers who survived carrying only their lives and trauma of experience, leaving behind equipment and supplies and comrades and ambitions that had brought them north, leaving behind too the confidence or innocence they might have had before learning what wilderness and winter and siege and disease could do to humans who believed determination was sufficient, carrying forward only knowledge that they had endured what seemed unendurable, and that endurance had not been enough for victory, but had been sufficient for survival. The retreat that left more than it carried being subtraction of everything, except essential core of human persistence, the stripping away of everything not absolutely necessary, revealing what remained when military organization and equipment and even hope were removed, the human animal trying to continue existing. The fundamental drive toward survival persisting after everything else had failed or been abandoned or died. The retreat being both defeat in military sense and triumph in human sense, depending on whether victory was measured by objectives achieved or by lives preserved, both assessments being valid but incompatible, the same retreat being disaster and salvation simultaneously. We sit with the pace of retreat, the necessity of moving quickly to stay ahead of British pursuit, conflicting with reality that sick and exhausted soldiers could not move quickly. The officers making brutal calculations about how fast column could move without losing everyone to exhaustion versus how slowly they could move without being caught. The balance being struck through leaving behind those who could not keep pace. The rate of march being determined by those who could continue rather than by those who needed to rest. The necessity overriding compassion, because stopping meant destruction of entire force, while continuing meant survival of some, even if not all. The pursuit by British regulars was half-hearted. The professional soldiers who had relieved Quebec following American retreat, but not pressing close, because disease in retreating columns made close pursuit dangerous. British commanders calculating that letting Americans retreat while maintaining distance was safer than destroying them and risking disease spreading to British ranks. The epidemiological consideration shaping military tactics in ways that saved American remnants from complete destruction. We reflect on retreats as military operations that are often more difficult than advances. The advancing army has momentum and hope and purpose, while retreating army has demoralization and uncertainty and sense of failure. The psychology of retreat being corrosive to discipline and to unit cohesion. The physical difficulty of retreat being compounded by mental difficulty of accepting defeat and abandoning objectives. Quebec retreat being particularly difficult because it followed wilderness march that had already exhausted soldiers and winter siege that had killed thousands and New Year's assault that had been disaster. The retreat being final stage of campaign that was disaster from beginning, but that had maintained hope until end. The giving up of that hope being painful in ways that physical hardships were not. The acknowledgement that everything had been for nothing being harder to bear than cold or hunger or disease had been because those physical sufferings had purpose if they led to victory, but had only futility if they led to retreat without accomplishment. We close contemplating what retreat left scattered along route south, the equipment that marked path like breadcrumbs, except that following them led not to destination, but only to more discarded possessions. The graves that marked where soldiers had died during retreat, sometimes marked with crosses or names, but often unmarked because time for proper burial was scarce. The memory traces that remained inhabitants' villages where sick Americans had been left to live or die. The psychological residue in survivors who carried trauma forward into futures that would be shaped by experience of campaign that failed. The retreat leaving behind material evidence of passage and human evidence of suffering and creating aftermath that would continue for years in bodies damaged by disease and frostbite, and in minds damaged by memories of comrades dead, and objectives unachieved and suffering that accomplished nothing. The retreat that left more than it carried being final accounting of campaign that began with hope and ended with loss, being journey that reversed spatial progress while leaving psychological marks that would never be completely erased, being testimony to limits of what revolutionary enthusiasm could achieve without adequate preparation and resources and luck. The leaving behind being acceptance that this campaign's purpose could not be salvaged, but that those who survived might yet matter in future campaigns. forever retreating, forever leaving behind, forever the subtraction, forever the trail marked by what was abandoned, forever the retreat that left more than it carried, forever. The failed Siege of Quebec became footnote rather than chapter in American Revolution's narrative, overshadowed by Declaration of Independence signed in July 1776, 6 weeks after retreat ended, by campaigns around New York that drew attention southward, by victories at Trenton and Princeton that provided hope after string of defeats, by Saratoga in 1777 that proved Americans could win major battles, by eventual victory at Yorktown that ended war, by simple fact that failures are less interesting to commemorate than successes, and that campaign which accomplished nothing except casualties became less prominent in historical memory than campaigns which changed war's trajectory. The aftermath being silence where stories might have been, absence where commemoration might have stood, forgetting that was almost complete except in memories of those who survived, and in families who mourned those who did not. We begin with survivors returning to their homes, men who had departed in autumn 1775, as part of bold expeditions returning in summer 1776, as broken remnants, carrying smallpox scars and frostbite damage and memories that could not be adequately shared with those who had not been there. Veterans of campaign that had failed being received not with celebration, but with sympathy, or with silence that acknowledged suffering, while not quite knowing how to honor sacrifice that had not produced victory. The return being anticlimactic after 9 months of hardship, because failures receive less public recognition than successes, even when failures involve equal or greater sacrifice. The official reports minimized disaster Washington's correspondence and Congress's proceedings, acknowledging that Quebec campaign had not succeeded, but framing failure as setback rather than as catastrophe, emphasizing circumstances beyond commander's control like weather and disease, rather than questioning whether attempting campaign had been wise decision in first place. The political necessity of maintaining morale and of maintaining confidence in Army's capabilities, requiring that failures be explained in ways that did not undermine continued recruitment and support. The public narrative being shaped to serve purposes that complete honesty about disaster would have undermined. The gap between official accounts and soldiers' experiences being substantial, with official reports describing unfortunate circumstances, where soldiers described horror and suffering, and complete failure of campaign to achieve any objectives. The private letters and diaries that described reality more honestly were not published or preserved in ways that would shape historical understanding until much later, if at all, the immediate aftermath being controlled by official narratives that minimized failure's extent, and that moved attention quickly to other campaigns where outcomes were more favorable. It is said that debates about whether attempting Quebec had been worthwhile began immediately and continued for decades, some arguing that bold attempt had been justified even though it failed, because potential benefits of adding Canada to rebellion would have been worth risks if campaign had succeeded. Others arguing that campaign had been strategic error from beginning because Americans lacked resources for taking fortified positions and for operating at such distances from supply bases that losses in men and materiel weakened American military capability overall, and that those losses bought nothing of value, the debates being irresolvable because counterfactuals about what might have happened if campaign had succeeded were unprovable, and because judgments depended on whether one prioritized audacity or prudence, risk-taking or conservation of resources. The arguments revealing different philosophies about how revolution should be conducted, but not producing consensus about whether Quebec campaign had been mistake or had been reasonable gamble that simply did not pay off. We descend into individual aftermaths. Arnold, who survived wound at Quebec and who returned to command, and who would win victories at Valker Island and at Saratoga before his betrayal in 1780. His role in Quebec campaign being part of complicated legacy where heroism and treachery coexisted, where early service to revolution was undeniable, but where later betrayal overshadowed everything that preceded it, making Arnold's Quebec service difficult to commemorate, because celebrating his courage there meant acknowledging that traitor had once been patriot. Daniel Morgan, who had wept when surrendering at Quebec, but who was exchanged as prisoner in 1776, and who would later command riflemen at Saratoga, and who would win decisive victory at Cowpens in 1781. His experience in Quebec campaign teaching lessons that shaped his future tactics, particularly about using terrain and about exploiting enemy weaknesses. The successful later career partially redeeming Quebec failure by demonstrating that lessons learned through defeat could inform victories that followed. The common soldiers who returned to farms and shops carrying trauma that 18th century had no vocabulary for describing, but that affected them nonetheless, men who woke from nightmares of cold and starvation, who bore permanent physical damage from frostbite that left fingers or toes missing or damaged, who lived decades after siege, but who never forgot those months outside Quebec, whose experiences were not recorded in ways that historians could easily access, but that shaped their own lives and their families' lives, even when larger history forgot them. Whispers tell us of non-remembering that followed the absence of monuments for decades after the siege, the failure to commemorate Arnold's march through Maine wilderness, despite it being remarkable feat of endurance, the overlooking of Montgomery's death at Quebec Barricade despite him being general officer killed in action which should have warranted significant memorialization. The collective decision that was not conscious, but that was effective nonetheless, that this campaign was not worth remembering in detail, because it did not fit narrative of inevitable American victory that developed after war was won, because dwelling on failures undermined revolutionary mythology that emphasized triumph and destiny, because success at Yorktown mattered more narratively than failure at Quebec, especially since Quebec failure had not prevented eventual victory in war overall. The forgetting was selective. Certain elements like Arnold's march became legendary for difficulty, while siege itself became footnote. Montgomery was eventually commemorated, but commemoration emphasized his character and sacrifice, rather than examining campaign that led to his death. The stories that were preserved were ones that could be incorporated into heroic narrative, while stories that complicated that narrative were allowed to fade. We witness how the siege was discussed in decades following initial references being relatively frequent in veterans' accounts, and in early histories of revolution, later references becoming less frequent as attention shifted to campaigns that had more dramatic outcomes or clearer lessons. 20th century scholarship recovering some details, but Quebec campaign never achieving prominence in public consciousness, comparable to battles like Bunker Hill or Saratoga or Yorktown. The decline from being discussed to being forgotten to being partially recovered through scholarship being trajectory that showed how historical memory was constructed through choices about what to emphasize and what to omit. The Quebec campaign being victim of those choices, because emphasizing it did not serve purposes that constructing national origin story served, because failures are less useful than successes for creating inspiring narratives, because admitting that revolution's early years included disasters as complete as Quebec suggested that outcome was less certain than mythology preferred to acknowledge. We sit with what silence means, whether forgetting serves purposes by allowing focus on successes rather than requiring dwelling on failures, whether those who suffered in failed campaigns deserve remembrance equal to those who suffered in successful campaigns, whether history's relative silence about Quebec siege is itself historical fact worth noting, because it reveals how memory is selective and political, how narrative requires omitting complications that do not serve story being told, how the past that is remembered is always smaller and simpler than the past that was lived. The silence about Quebec being testimony to how history is constructed through active remembering and through passive forgetting, through conscious decisions about what matters and unconscious biases about what is interesting, through political uses of past that favor certain stories, and through simple human tendency to find successes more compelling than failures. The aftermath that history almost forgot being testament to how vulnerable historical events are to being erased from collective memory if they do not serve present purposes. How much of past is lost not because records were destroyed, but because no one chose to preserve or to repeatedly tell stories that records contained. How forgetting is as powerful as remembering in shaping what past we inherit. We reflect on obligation to remember failures alongside successes, the moral argument that those who suffered deserve remembrance regardless of whether their suffering produced victory. That honoring sacrifice means acknowledging all sacrifice, not just sacrifice that led to favorable outcomes. That complete history requires including failures, because understanding how revolution succeeded requires understanding how it failed and how it learned from failures. The practical argument that lessons from failures are often more valuable than lessons from successes, because failures reveal limits and expose errors, while successes can create false confidence. The Quebec campaign teaching Americans that some objectives were beyond their capability, and that attempting them cost lives without producing benefits. Lessons that shaped future operations, and that made eventual victory possible by teaching what not to attempt. The remembering being act of historical justice toward those who suffered, and act of practical wisdom that preserved lessons, even when preserving them meant acknowledging painful truths about revolutionary struggle being uncertain and costly, and including disasters that mythology preferred to omit. We close contemplating aftermath as space where events settle into memory or fade, into forgetting the Quebec siege residing in that liminal space, where it is not completely forgotten because records exist and because some historians study it, but where it is also not prominently remembered because public consciousness focuses elsewhere. The aftermath being long, slow process of transition from recent event to historical event to nearly forgotten event. The campaign that seemed enormously significant to participants becoming footnote in narratives that emphasize other events. The silence settling like dust over stories that might have been told. The forgetting being testament to how much past is lost even when records survive because remembering requires active choice, and Quebec campaign was not chosen, was allowed to fade until it existed primarily in archives that few consult and in academic histories that few read and in family stories that few families still tell. The aftermath that history almost forgot being final tragedy of campaign that began with ambition and ended with failure. The silence being erasure that claimed campaign after disease and defeat had claimed soldiers. The forgetting being testament to how easily even significant events can disappear from collective memory when they do not serve purposes that present requires from past. Forever fading, forever nearly forgotten, forever residing in margins of history, forever the aftermath, forever the silence, forever the campaign that almost disappeared, forever testimony to how memory is selective, forever the Siege of Quebec 1775, almost forgotten, almost gone, almost erased, but preserved here, remembered tonight, acknowledged as mattering despite not succeeding. Forever. The night deepens now. The stories have been told. The year 17,751,776 has been explored from the gathering at Cambridge and Fort Western to the march through Maine wilderness, from the struggle up the Dead River to the arrival at Quebec's stone walls, from the winter siege through smallpox epidemic to the failed New Year's assault, from the spring thaw that brought British reinforcements to the desperate retreat that left more behind than it carried, from the aftermath that history almost forgot to the silence that settled over campaign that did not succeed. The Siege of Quebec was failure by military measures. The fortress was not taken. Canada did not become 14th colony. The soldiers who endured wilderness march and winter siege achieved no strategic objectives. The campaign cost thousands of casualties through combat and disease and hardship, without producing benefits that justified those costs. The failure being complete in sense that nothing that was attempted was accomplished. But the campaign was also testament to human endurance, the soldiers who walked through Maine wilderness, surviving conditions that planning had not anticipated, and that maps had not revealed. The expedition that should have died in wilderness reaching Quebec against odds. The force that maintained siege through winter despite disease and starvation, demonstrating capacity for suffering that exceeded what seemed humanly possible. The survivors who returned carrying knowledge of their own resilience, even if not carrying victory. Rest now. Let these difficult stories settle like snow after storm. Let the cold recede into history where it belongs. Let the suffering be acknowledged but not dwelt upon. Let the lessons remain about ambition's limits, about the cost of failures, about human endurance in circumstances that tested everything, about how history remembers and forgets, about campaigns that matter despite not succeeding, about soldiers who deserve honor even when they did not achieve victory. The past is gone, but its echoes remain. Sleep now. The night holds you. The silence is earned. The memories rest. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, Arnold's expedition marches, still forever walking through autumn forests toward Quebec, forever struggling up the dead river, forever outside stone walls in winter cold, forever retreating southward through spring thaw, forever caught between confidence of beginning and catastrophe of ending, forever testament to what was risked and what was lost in the campaign that history almost forgot. Sleep well. The campaign is over. The retreat has ended. The survivors have returned or have found rest where they fell. The walls still stand. The letters are silent. History remembers what it chooses. But tonight, we have remembered what was almost forgotten. Rest. Forever the Siege of Quebec 1775. Forever the campaign that failed. Forever the soldiers who endured. Forever remembered tonight even if history forgets tomorrow. Forever testimony to revolutionary struggles, uncertainty, and cost. Forever the wilderness march and the winter siege, and the spring retreat, and the aftermath that faded into silence. Forever.